Thank you. I have a few quick comments for Atul. I really wish you had started, the first thing that I wish you had started this by saying that as a result of the public feeling in India after the 1962 war, the Communist Party of India was forced to split into a so-called nationalist and the internationalist faction. But since communism and its effect, Indian communism and its effect on the aftermath of the war is not exactly the title of your paper, perhaps you left it to the end. The second was this US arms flow into India that you mentioned. Mr. Rapai has referred to it. There wasn't very much. So, I mean, to talk, blandly that there was a US arms flow in your paper would give people the impression that there was a huge influx. There was a lot of, say, woolen clothing, military winter clothing, military boots. And I was an army brat at the time, but, teenager enough to see all this stuff coming. What did come in was C-130s of the US Air Force, which flew supplies around the place. So, and as far as the combat weapons, there really weren't any. So you might want to modify that. I have a major issue when you say the British encouraged communist infiltration into the Indian armed forces prior to independence. It is my understanding that it is not the British as an adjective, but the British communists. And it's not the British as a government. It was the British communists who were trying to do this prior to independence. And while they may have influenced a certain amount of the intake, you talked about Amir Abdullah Khan Niazi, who became a Pakistani general eventually and surrendered to Indian forces in Dhaka, and there could have been more. But it certainly wasn't a Indian, that is British-run Indian government or British government from Whitehall, which was trying to do this. In fact, soon after independence, the IB, the Intelligence Bureau of India, was screening all entrants, particularly officer entrants and even men, into the Indian Armed Forces for communist leanings who were not allowed and RSS leanings. I'm sure as a former Armed Forces officer yourself, you're well aware that both RSS and communists were not allowed to be inducted into the Indian Armed Forces. Lastly, regarding this, the flow, and this is related to the previous one when you talked about Indian food going to Tibet. Indian food always used to go to Tibet via Kalimpong, which was the major trading town, because it's the nearest trade depot or was to the Lhasa Lhasa area. There was just a huge increase after 54 because of the artificial famine created in Tibet by the influx of the PLA. So when you say the British encouraged Glaxo, these were commercial companies, Hindustan Lever, Glaxo, they were selling goods. It was purely commercial. The Marwari traders in Kalimpong were already selling a whole lot of stuff every year. Every year, September, October, the caravans would arrive, they would go. But suddenly from 54 onwards, the sale of rice and wheat and foodstuffs became large because of the scarcities in Tibet. So if you say it's the British who were trying to do it, I think that imputation is kind of incorrect. It's just commercial. Thank you very much.
My question is to Jonathan, and I found your presentation quite interesting particularly because you do mention a substantive breakup in the relationship between India and China, and not quite in these terms, but you actually locate the three main variables in foreign policy analysis of China, which is the worldview of Chinese foreign policy, the China's modernization project, and the third one could be actually the identity project of China, which is closely related to territoriality and questions of sovereignty. So rather than just focusing on question of sovereignty and territory, you do digress into these two other variables, which is the modernization project. Because in your abstract, you mentioned that China found India as a threat to its modernization of building up of New China. So if you could sort of briefly elaborate on that issue, and also the fact that how exactly you do mention about a realignment of strategy in Asia at that point of time. So my other question is linked to the variable of worldview. How is it that realignment in Asia during that time, not aligning India with China, was not perceived as a missed opportunity? I mean, what was the crucial juncture? I mean, because you looked into Chinese archives, so if there are certain variables or crucial key elements that you could identify, that why it wasn't perceived as a missed opportunity of, you know, of that of building up a relationship with India rather than try, I mean, so I mean, really 2 points: how India was a threat to China's development or building up of a new China, and the other one is this question that I mentioned. Thank you.
I've just asked to Mr. Bhardwaj, this is the time when immediately after India became independent, and Nehru government not only became sensitive towards communist, it became sensitive towards right-wing organizations also. And as far as Sheikh Abdullah, his relation with Nehru was already deteriorated before, much before 1962. So it is not that 1962 is the landmark of this kind of, maybe this book. So I want to know more about what are the other books, what are the other organizations were banned, because banning is actually undemocratic kind of thing, and so this is a much more complex problem, I think. So I want your response.
Conscious decision to stay away from the figure of the Dalai Lama. Is that an archival issue, or is that a conscious decision from the researcher? And this is to both speakers. And how does the archival silence around the Dalai Lama, how does it affect the study of the dispute in both countries and their respective archives?
Thanks. A methodological question to Jonathan. We've already sort of today touched upon the difference in the relationship between decision making and the public dialogue in India and China, where in India, the public dialogue affects decision making, whereas in China, the decision making informs public dialogue. Now, in these documents that you've accessed and that you're using to draw conclusions, would you get the sense that the text and the logic in this informed decision making, or did decision making flow down to these documents and then the logic writers got to work and you had the leader saying, wow, that's a good idea, I should have thought of that myself? I mean, what would you consider the dialectic between decision making and the documents?
Okay, I'll go first. Let me take the questions in the order in which I got them, I guess. So the first one, Isabella, about how Chinese explained Indian motives. I think this is a really interesting question, because there's so much uncertainty, I think, surrounding the border war, and on one hand, one of the official military histories of the border war by one of the institutes in China talks about how Nehru wanted to form a great Asian empire with Tibet as the buffer zone. Chinese historians using various documents have talked about an Indian empire spanning the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, things like that. There's a little sort of apocryphal chapter written by John W. Garver using a book with somebody who was apparently in the room with Mao and then it was banned, which also had this concern about an idea of India sort of annexing Tibet. So it's hard to separate the sort of clear ideas of what people believed through the sort of franticness of what was being assumed in the heat of the moment. And I think when you look at sort of Chinese histories of the war, there is this idea that Nehru specifically and particularly was interested in sort of expanding Indian power in a territorial way. That's not something that you find as much in the diplomatic documents. But again, I should mention I'm at the beginning of my research, really. I mean, I've done a lot of sort of secondary material, and will be spending a lot more time with primary documents. So again, just a great question for me to carry with me as I do this doctorate. Yeah, and I don't think there's really the idea that another way to look at it, though, is sort of the Marxist, like, imperialist idea that was, obviously very strong in China in those years, was, to have Nehru as this sort of lackey of imperialism, and to have this sort of presence of American imperialists as a controlling or dangerous force. And by that time, I mean, even regarding the nuclear umbrella, I mean, what I'm really working with on that one is a bunch of declassified documents on the American side, where you have conversations between Kennedy and his cabinet, and they're absolutely debating the idea of, like, why don't we just bring India into the nuclear umbrella? Kennedy, from what I read, unless I'm not remembering this correctly, was very into this idea. I'd be actually very curious to learn more about it from what you've read. And then aircraft, of course, there's very much the idea that had aircraft been used in the war, India would have had an advantage. None of the foreign powers involved wanted any sort of escalation. So that wouldn't have been encouraged, but at the same time there were all these sort of defensive plans. That's what really most of this was about, was the sort of after effects of the war and how to help India. The UK and the US specifically were trying to come up with ideas of how to help India defend itself rather than escalate the war. So, a lot of that had to do with the idea of basing aircraft. And there were debates over that again. I mean, it's, that's one of the challenges with all the diplomatic documents that I have to work with is when a bunch of people are talking about something, to what extent does that really mean anything? There's a lot of discussion.
That was money for Boeing.
Let's see. Likewise, at the flow of small arms, there are documents that delineate how much of it was actually sent into India. So that's easier to deal with. Let me see. India is a threat to the new China in terms of modernization. I guess the idea that I'm really working with here, although modernization certainly could be a very interesting part of it, is the idea of a new Chinese identity that in a way has more to do with the Bainian Guochi, or the 100 Years of Humiliation. The idea that there's this new China after 100 years, with the founding of the PRC, and this is very relevant to today, and ever since, the idea that China's not going to be abused or be a weak country or that sort of thing. I'm not sure how much that has to do with modernization, so much as the idea that there's the end of this period of humiliation. And I think this really starts with the sort of Maoist idea of the Chinese people have stood up. And, the idea that India could be a threat to that is something that I have a lot more, learning to do. But it's just very interesting to me that the only other countries that have ever been credited with that sort of level of contest to that new Chinese identity were the superpowers. So, in many ways, people think that China doesn't regard India as a huge challenger, as a serious power, or something like that. But I think you see the opposite in these documents. You see that China, India had the ability to drive China into such a state of alarm that you go to this war that, in the long run, it really looks like that was probably a regrettable thing, and it absolutely shattered the relationship. But I think the state of alarm surrounding these border incursions very much to do with Nehru's forward policy, and accentuated by the role of the superpowers, China's sort of own isolation at the period. I think those are the kinds of things that lead it into the idea that India was this bulwark for something that could really challenge the idea of an inviolable China, which is, of course, essential to the China that we know today, and the project that began back then. And also the idea that the realignment of Asia and why perceived as a missed opportunity for China and India to come together. I think that's one of the most important and interesting questions in this whole thing. It's like, why did you get to this point where it made less sense to have India as a friend and ally than to just go to war and So that in a way is like the heart of my doctorate is just why did the two break apart? And on one hand, you're looking for signals of that within the cooperation. I think on one hand, there's the Panchsheel agreement was meant in a sense to contain the dangers that each side presented to each other. You know, on one hand, Nehru never really believed that the Chinese would have an army in Tibet. And when you had, he just thought it wasn't physically possible. I mean, there are going to be all kinds of documents that could contradict this, but from what I've read thus far, that was his position. It was like, you know, we can make this sort of agreement in which we're not necessarily completely settled on what Tibet means to us, but we're not going to worry about the PLA being in there. But then in 1959, you have the PLAs right there on India's border in a way for the first time. So in a sense, it's one thing to be thinking about brotherhood and talking about 2,000 years of friendship and shared history, when in a way you're not quite sharing the border yet, you know, administratively and militarily. And then it sort of becomes, you know, that's when things, you know, some scholars like Chen Jian see that as the turning point by the time you have the PLA right there. And of course, you know, China through Panchsheel wants to sort of diminish the possibility of India being involved in Tibetan affairs. So those, in a way, there's a very realpolitik aspect to Panchsheel, as much as it's sort of a grander idealistic thing. And yeah, again, I mean, even the Sino-Soviet split, I mean, I think that's a great guide for how China was breaking up with others in that period, because you know, there are a couple of good books written on that one, and one of them basically decides that China wasn't going to accept the role of junior partner in any relationship, even with the USSR, the main superpower. So then, of course, Nehruist vision of Asia, in which India would basically be a leader of a sort of world in which Asian identity was broadly shared, the idea that he believed that Chinese communism would eventually be subsumed by Chinese culture. And you know, I guess they were very competing visions for, and I don't think they really truly shared a sense of where things were going in that period. It was very ideological. It just didn't really connect, I think. Let me see. Conscious decision to stay away from the Dalai Lama. I don't know. I mean, he's in there in a lot of documents. You'll find a lot of reference to the Dalai Lama, and that's something that just plainly was an issue in China-India relations. I mean, by the time the Dalai Lama has fled into India, I mean, that's a big, complicated one. I haven't, you know, touched on that in a particular way. I mean, you can't really ignore it in the long run, but you know, there's some really interesting sort of public, you know, Renmin Rubal newspaper articles about that really explain sort of how China at least was publicly willing to express itself on the subject. So I could talk about that later. But also for decision-making, public dialogue. The nature of the documents that I was looking at would be the kind of thing where you'd have like the Chinese embassy from anywhere in the world would report on what was going on in the country. Let's say, you know, that could be India or Bangladesh or what have you, reporting on local activity or international activity. And then you'd see that Mao might have read it, or in many, many cases, Zhou Enlai or Deng Xiaoping, or just the whole top leadership would be reading these things. You know, the foreign ministry doesn't have sort of internal conversations. That's something that it's just not going to be around. But so I think it's hard to pitch. It's hard to know that, because the access that you'd actually have to like Deng and Zhou and Mao, you know, Deng was always there, but Zhou and Mao conversations is just, I don't know, if that ever comes out, I'd be obviously very interested, I'm sure we all would. But these are basically embassy reportings and also conversations between diplomats. So it'll be like the Indian ambassador talking to Zhou Enlai, or Nehru's visit to Beijing and reporting on that. So again, the decision making I think is really a bit of a black box, but you can learn about at least some of the thought that was going on. And you know, that's one of the challenges here in writing on this for me, is like, you know, you have lots of interesting ideas floating around, but which ones of them became sources of action is I don't think we have a way to determine that. But you can get into at least currents of thought that can help. Thank you.
Isabella's question about how big the book was. The book was big because, in the sense that for 9 years it existed, and it had one of the top Faiz Scott, again Sahil Ludhianvi, all these are very, very big poets. So there was no question of the book not, must have sold well. I don't know the figures, how much it sold, because but people who were interested in poetry at that time. And another thing was that the mood in the country that time was, shifting towards the progressive forces. The progressive forces were quite strong. The left forces in India were quite strong at that stage. And that's one reason why Nehru probably adopted, joining up with the Soviet Union. And that was, I consider personally, that is to be his masterstroke, political masterstroke, which killed the communist movement in India the moment he joined hands with Soviet Union. And the next issue was that, Anand, you said any other particular book. I haven't found any other particular book, but there was the one book by a Chinese professor who was in Delhi University. I am not good at Chinese, so I am not able to pronounce his name. He was in Delhi University in early 50s. He had written a book on the modern history of China. And he, again, the same MP who has actually asked for this book to be banned, he had asked for that book also to be banned. And he was not a communist by any chance. But then, and he had written a lot on Buddhism also. And then he was shifted to Allahabad University. The moment in 62 this came up, Chiang, I'll give you the name later. But then this
book was published in History of Buddhism from
Allahabad University, and he had published this book on modern Chinese history, in which he had published, in which one map was published, which showed all the territories belonging, which we claim to be belonging to China. So he was asked that why you have shown this, and that book had also existed since 1953. So that book also was banned, was asked to be banned by the same MP who was, Firaq Hussain. So then that book basically, and he said that he's copied that map from an English writer's book, which was published in 1950. Ken Follett was the name of the author of the book, from whom he had borrowed that map, and he had published it in his book, he said. So that was the story. So basically it was nothing to do with the books as such. Books are not causing any great kind of an upsurge in the society at that stage. They were written, long back. Basically, books were being used as a propaganda tool. When this MP of Rajya Sabha was writing to the Home Minister, he was actually writing when there was a Chief Minister's conference going on with the Prime Minister, denouncing the Chinese action, and how to keep the communists out. Basically, the mood was how the communists need to be kept out of the Defense Council, which was being formed at that time. And they were being kept out, you had all parties being represented in it, barring the Communist Party. So this is how some reason was being created, to keep them out, primarily. And, as far as you're saying, it is not that the Communist Party was did not favor. There were a lot of things which were being said about that they are traitors or something, and they are passing on information about Bomdila and Sela Pass to Chinese. Now I don't think, because even the Indian soldiers were not aware of those territories, so for the communists to be aware, it was a little difficult for them to pass any information at that stage over there. But that was a kind of propaganda, because any war, if you actually see, is used by people. When the war happens, people who actually want to gain out of it, like we've all heard about traders using the war, when they hike up their prices or hoard stuff. Similarly, there are political players who also use wars. There are international players who also use wars. Now, if you see, here I'm talking about that this was a growing movement, and there was, a mood in the country amongst, and the most powerful players at that stage. Nehru was, one single player, but all along his cabinet were mainly rightist people. his entire cabinet was consisted of rightist people, from Morarji Desai to Krishnamachari, to everybody for that matter. So one cannot say that this was being, and so there had to be something to check this movement. And it was a politics is played every time. Politics was played even then.
No, I didn't dispute that aspect.
So my point of view is that this book was used basically to play politics and use war to achieve those ends. In terms of Krishna Menon, if you see, and there is some very fine paper, which I found on the net, and it was presented in one Slavic, research center conference by Hasberg James, G. James, and he's brought out wonderfully well in this paper. Galbraith diaries are available, but they don't give. There are lots missing in those diaries. But he's actually got access to the private papers of Galbraith, which is missing in those diaries, and he's brought out so well how Galbraith was delaying giving arms to India, deliberately delaying giving arms to India, and he wanted Nehru to write a letter to him first. He wanted that these people should actually requisition. Nehru wrote those letters to Kennedy on 19th November, those 2 letters asking for arms. And he said that he wanted to finish off Krishna Menon in his diaries. And he said and that also relates to the air power, why the Indians did not use air power. Because he said if we are going to give them air power, Krishna Menon is going to emerge victorious in this war. He's already won the Goa for India. He did not want to give Krishna Menon another victory. So these are things which we need to dig deeper into. Thank you.
Just a point. I think both the presenters gave very good description of the complex situation which arose after 1962 war. And yesterday we received one page from Times of India, and that actually affirm what you all are saying. And the first news is Sri Mama Bandanaike and the Foreign Minister of Indonesia meeting Chou En-lai, and the report is that after a lavish dinner, Chou En-lai said that China will not waver from having border resolution with India. And then the other was that Pakistan had the first ever trade pact with China on the 6th of January 1963. This is a page from 6th of January 1963. And then this end aggression starts Nehru talking about China not responding to July later to China. So
Well, much thanks for everyone. I think we have more discussions and remarks in the afternoon. Now I have to say that's all of the session. Thank you.
Yesterday being the kind of a socio-cultural interaction through study of intellectuals, activists, travelogues, and so on. And today being focused on the border, the 62 experience, so that's how the 2 days were structured. So you reflect on these 2 themes, reflect on the kind of advance we see in our researches and weaknesses that we see in our researches and deliberations. which will help us to find new methodological, theoretical ways of moving forward in academic research, which we believe always has policy and practical implications. So it's now open. Yes, Martha.
I think this has been one of the really good seminars which I've attended recently. And I do think that India-China studies really has advanced a lot in the last few years. I mean, I can see much more maturity in terms of themes, in terms of approaches, in terms of collaboration. And I think this seminar, though it's short, it's a 1.5-day seminar, it reflected some of that. So one thing which I really liked about this seminar is this looking at the 20th century as a whole. The 1949 or 47 divide was really nicely spanned, I think. And I think this is the way you have to look at